We are happy to see that people from different parts of the world are being part of this webinar. Just a few settings. We try to keep the webinar to 1.5 hours. So we would have 2 presenters where each talk for 30 minutes. And then after those 2 presentations, we would have 30 minutes for questions and answers. You can see on your screen that there is a questions panel. So whenever a question arises, you are most welcome to pose it there. After the 2 presentations, I would then pick up those questions and post them to the presenters. Please ensure that you indicate who the question is addressed to. So if it is Shritu or Alexander, so we post them to the correct speaker. Another information that I would like to share is that you can also download the presentations. For that, you can see a panel that says handouts. You find the 2 presentations as well as the flyer for the webinar there that you can download as long as you're a live participant. So without further ado, I would like to get started and briefly introduce the 2 speakers. We have Dr. Shritu Shrestha with us. She is a research fellow at the Wuppertal Institute for Climate, Environment and Energy. And Shritu has a years-long experience on low carbon urban mobility in action. She was engaged in a lot of EU projects and has a lot to share in terms of concrete actions. Second speaker lined up is Dr. Alexander Mirescu, who is the business unit head for urban resilience at Pontarolo Engineering in Canada, and he's also a promoter of the United Nations Making Cities Resilient campaign. We are very excited to have those speakers with us today and look forward to an exciting input and to an exciting discussion with the participants. Alexander will be talking about resilient transport, since he has had hands-on experience of a case of a resilient BRT system in Toronto, which is very innovative and very exciting, and we look forward to that presentation as well. Sustainable transport solutions, they offer significant mitigation potential. We all know that transport is a great achiever of climate change goals if it is done in a sustainable way. And Shritu will introduce a little bit on what kind of actions could contribute to a low carbon future of our cities. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Shritu Shrestha, and please, to all the participants, don't forget to ask questions and indicate who they are addressed to.
Thank you, Steffi. Just technical issues.
Apologies for the slight delay. We are just getting started with the presentation. Maybe we just do it like that.
This process.
That's my problem.
Should I do it from myself?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay.
It's okay now.
Yeah.
Can we show like two slides like that, or make a bigger one?
Yeah, just try.
Can I?
They know it.
This
I'm good to go.
Our apologies for the delay. We faced some struggles to show the right screen, but it seems to be functional now. And I would like to hand over to Dr. Shritu Shrestha.
Hello, everyone. Sorry from my side too. So I'm going to present low carbon urban mobility in actions, which is a part of Urban Pathways webinar series. So I'm Shritu Shrestha, as Steffi already introduced. I'm from Wuppertal Institute based in Berlin. So I'm working on building energy and resource policy development, sustainable cities and transport, and climate action. This is an overview of my presentation. I'm going to talk briefly on urban mobility trends and drivers, the new urban agenda and urban mobility, low carbon mobility solutions or examples from different parts of the world, highlight in action in Urban Pathways project. Cities today occupy just 2% of total land, but it is responsible for almost 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, out of which transport is responsible for 24% of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. So urbanization growth and increase in mobility, mainly in car demand, are the major concern in cities. So identifying institutional barrier in the uptake of process of low carbon transport measures is not only relevant for industrialized countries where emissions from this sector need to be reduced drastically and action needs to start now, but also particularly relevant for emerging countries where rapid growth and infrastructure development can create lock-in into the high carbon energy and transport pathways. So setting the transport sector on low carbon development pathways is essential for global climate change mitigation efforts. So to contribute below 2-degree target, developed countries will have to rapidly decarbonize the transport sector over the coming decades, reducing 80% by 2050, and developing and emerging countries will have to curb growth 70% by 2050, which requires a substantial policy action. The new urban agenda from Habitat 3 Cities conference encouraged to embrace urbanization and develop cities that provide safe, efficient, and easy access to urban basic services and change mobility system towards low carbon stabilization pathways. The low carbon stabilization pathways provide many co-benefits, such as fuel cost savings up to $10 trillion US by 2050, reduce vehicle purchase and needed infrastructure Yeah, so also provide indirect benefits of improved safety, air quality. Talking about low carbon mobility solutions, many of you might transport, they are avoid, shift, and improve. So I'm going to talk briefly about these three approaches and examples for low carbon mobility solutions, some of which are a part of our finished project solutions funded by European Commission. After solution project, the action platform named Urban Electric Mobility Initiative was initiated by UN Habitat and Solution Projects, where you can find these solutions in detail. So going to the first approach, avoid. So avoiding vehicle travel by reduced trip distances, for example, by developing compact cities and mixed use of city development that can easily accessible by non-motorized transport. It has economic implication due to reduced congestion. Also, it provides improved access and mobility and also health benefits. Other benefits are reduced land consumption and energy use, and equitable access and so forth. So, for example, road users charging in London produce 25% of CO2, and funds collected through London's congestion charges can be reinvented, for example, for public transport. Other mobility solutions to avoid unnecessary vehicle use is to prioritize non-motorized transport. One example to improve pedestrian space, cycling and public transit in Santiago, Chile, where they also close streets for cars on weekends to give space for pedestrian and cyclists. With this street improvement, use of cycle has doubled, and then came bike sharing program and free bicycle taxi in tourist center to encourage the users. Other example to improve urban access and avoid vehicle travel is by making bicycle easier and bringing in cycling initiatives in the city, such as Pedal Belo Horizonte, with increased bicycle users and by a good pedestrian infrastructure is also necessary to avoid vehicle use that improves safety and comfort, as well as that reduce the traffic speed and accidents. Parking management also reduces vehicle entrance in the city and gives an opportunity to use alternative means of transport, such as park and ride facilities. The example in Barcelona for parking management, where you can see the picture on the bottom left, with blue and green zones allows limited parking time and differentiate residents and non-residents for parking spaces or parking services. So the second approach is shift to more energy efficient mode. Energy efficient mode is the next approach to lower carbon emission in mobility sector, such as public transport, bicycle sharing, and car sharing. It has energy efficient potential of up to 30%. Economically, it provides it improves productivity due to reduced urban congestion and travel time across all modes. It has also the social and environmental benefits that include reduced air pollution, health benefits, and less impact on ecosystem. The example of BRT on the right, in Bogota, Colombia, reduced CO2 emission by 500,000 tons in 3 years, reducing commuting time and accidents, as well as improved air quality. The third, another example is another example to shift to energy efficient mode is DART, the Dar es Salaam bus rapid transit in Tanzania. So DART has significantly reduced travel time from 2 to 4 hours trip to 45 minutes, and also it has a disability access and has easy fare payment systems with a smart card. Bicycle sharing system and real-time monitoring to low carbon mobility solution is to improve the efficiency of vehicle fleet and use or improve intensity that include fuel shift and reduce carbon emission. It improves energy security, health, and reduce air pollution. One example is public transport fuel switch to hybrid or electric bus. So with this electric vehicle, one issue is the CO2 emission reduction potential depends on the electricity mix in the country. One good example we have from India is e-rickshaw or e-tuk-tuk for first and last mile connectivity. The smart e-rickshaw reduced the CO2 emission of 82,000 tons annually. Besides that, it gives priority to women drivers, which also provide economic security for women. Other good example of fuel 2017 in San Joaquin. So this system, or it can travel approximately 40 kilometers or 2 hours in a charge, and the bus can be recharged in 10 minutes, which is super quick. Other example is light rail, which has higher capacity than BRT, zero emissions during operation and lower noise, but its infrastructure cost is considerably higher than BRT. So implementing these low carbon mobility solution in a city require both technical and financial cooperation, with supporting policies, which include stakeholder dialogue, coalition building, and potential synergies identification, as well as look for wider benefits, including economic, social, and environment. Support for complementary measures and identify linkage between policy and infrastructure. So sometimes with this isolated implementation of measure, there can be a risk of rebound effect. For example, fuel efficiency improves efficiency of overall fleet, but may also induce additional travel as fuel costs decrease for the individual users. So in the road transport, rebound effect is seen up to 32% and may lead to uncertainty of policies cost effectiveness and its effect on energy efficiency. Therefore, integrated policy measures is required. So I'm going to talk briefly on this. So therefore, integrated integrated policy or policy integration include a combination of qualitative improvements to alternative modes like walking, cycling, and public transit services, incentive to discourage carbon incentive modes such as fuel pricing, vehicle fuel efficiency regulation, and taxation, and integrated transport and land use planning, which create more compact, mixed, and better connected communities with less need to travel. Integrated policy measures need political support. So political environment vary by country and change over time. Stable politics is necessary for long-term investment, and institutional aspects such as presence or absence of an environment ministry at the national level or environment department at local level affect implementation of climate-related transport measures. Therefore, transformational change or decarbonizing transport to 1.5 to 2 degrees require require integrated policies. So the implementation of singular measure at local and national level provides just incremental change of 2.5 to 3 degrees. So you can see in the graphs on the right side, the graphic well illustrate the process to follow the path from incremental to transformational change. So now I'm going to briefly introduce you about our ongoing Urban Pathways project supported by International Climate Initiative of Germany. So it supports low carbon plans for urban basic services, including transport, but also as well as energy and waste management. Our pilot countries are India, Vietnam, Kenya, and Brazil. And we are also working on 20 replication cities in the region. The project has 4 pillars, as you can see on the right side, like inform, inspire, initiate, and implement. So within this project, the mobility activities that we are working on include capacity building, technical and political assessment of mobility at country and city level, city partnership, and good practice concept. So I'm going to brief you shortly in the following slides, our activities. The project informs various stakeholders about the mitigation and sustainable development potential of sustainable urban mobility through, as you can see, the fact sheets, webinar, and e-learning facilities. For the urban mobility, basically, the Urban Pathways project has synergies on our ongoing project Future Jeddah and urban electric mobility initiatives. And the project also inspires stakeholders through various capacity building and change maker program, and also facilitates city-to-city partnership. As you can see, some of our capacity partnership activity that we are conducting on the right. Through the project, we also initiate mobility action in partner cities or countries by policy environment study, project scoping in close cooperation with cities, considering the challenges and need, and also provide funding solutions options for the project. As you can see, papers for these activities are available online in the project website, which anybody can download and go through it. Lastly, Urban Pathways project tried to create synergies with other related projects and carry out steps to action for identified projects. So far, we are currently working on pedestrian zone 30 and bike lanes in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, introducing e-rickshaws in Kochi, India, operating e-tuk-tuks named Safa Tempo in Kathmandu, Nepal. Likewise, developing and supporting cycling and walking street and bike share in Kenya. This was a recent, so this was identified during our Nairobi kickoff and workshop last week for urban pathways, where city counties were participated, and this need on the mobility was identified. And also we are working on project concept on e-scooter sharing in Vietnam. Oops. With this, I try to show the overview of low carbon mobility solutions available in different parts of the world, and considering the supporting policy requirements to realize these solutions versus so please visit our website, Urban Pathways, which is www.urban-pathways.org. And so the slide has been a little bit distorted, but you can see in the handouts the Pathways link, and also UMI website. Action. With this, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Shritu, for providing us with a compilation of different actions towards low carbon mobility solutions. I encourage the participants to go onto the websites because they really provide detailed documents on those pilot projects and on different best practices around the world. And I think those ones, they can really provide a great learning experience for all of us that we could learn from, and hopefully at one point also integrate in our work in the institutions or the cities that we are engaged in. So for the ones that have joined later, I would like to mention once more that we have the presentations ready for download. You need to go to the panel that says handout and the number 3. You would find the flyer as well as the 2 presentations there to be downloaded. As well as I also would like to encourage you to ask questions that might arise. We will be answering them at the end of the webinar. And we would be happy to receive a lot of questions from the audience on the presentations. Questions you can raise in the questions panel. So just type your questions, but indicate who you would like to address it to, because we will now listen to the second presentation. Dr. Alexander Mirescu, I mentioned before, has a lot of experience on resilient BRT systems, and will share with us a very innovative approach towards combining drainage and BRT infrastructure, which I think is quite unique in the world as of now. And we really believe that improvements and actions towards increasing the resilience and the adaptive capacity of transport infrastructure is also a key to combat the impacts of climate change. There's a lot of events that we all of us are recalling from the last many years, where floodings or hurricanes or other natural disasters really messed up the transport systems in cities, and with that also messed up the movements of the people out of their cities to a safer space. So I think that innovative approach take a little bit of action towards spreading such an innovative approach. Without further ado,
Hello, Steffi. I think you were just about to introduce me. I'm just trying to open up my handout. if you just bear with me just 1 second while the document opens.
Yes, Alex, we are here. We can hear you well, and we can see your screen. So,
Excellent. Great.
yeah, should work out.
But it's just opening right now. Here we go. And once I get the presentation materials open here, I will introduce myself properly, although Steffi gave a very good overview. Just one quick second. Let me see. I think I will just, instead of opening it from the GoTo website, I'll open it from my computer. It's the same document. There we go. Right, we'll start with this one.
Yes, sir.
Can everyone, it should be opening right now. Can everyone see my screen? Right, here we go. Okay.
Perfect, we can see it.
Excellent. So let me make it larger. Here we go. Okay. Everyone can see the first slide here, the introductory slide? I'm sorry, can everyone see this my screen now?
Yes, we can see it very
Excellent.
well. Thank you.
Thank you, Steffi. So just a brief introduction of who I am and what I do. I'm Dr. Alexander Mirescu. I have been working in this area of urban resilience for about 10 years. When I first started to work at the United Nations, I worked at UNDP for a few years, where I was doing some synthesis reports on aid effectiveness and successful project delivery. And it was at that point, this was 2009, and if you remember, 2009, 2010, 2011, there were these things had been happening, but this is around 10 years ago is when the UN system and national governments and global actors started to ask themselves questions about essentially why are they losing so much money over not being better prepared for disasters and for other types of disturbances. And at the time, people really started to ring the alarms rather, on climate change. And not only that climate change is a bad thing, which we all know it is, and Shritu's presentation more than highlighted that. And it was a very impressive presentation. I learned quite a lot about decarbonization for cities and transportation. But the other thing is we started to see that it was climate change costs money, it is bad business, and is really disrupting lives in terms of transportation, economics, socioeconomic, cultural activities. And after working at the UN, I went into academia. I have a PhD in political science, and I lectured on comparative politics and global development strategies. And over that 6-year period, I started to research and publish more and more on questions of development strategies and resilient practice and what we call disaster risk reduction, DRR. And it was at that time that I was selected by the Special Representative to the Secretary General to be a promoter for the United Nations Making Cities Resilient campaign. And then most recently, I then consulted for a while, but quite recently, I'm proud to announce that I was asked to lead up the Urban Resilience Business Unit at Pontarolo Engineering. It's a Canadian company, a very innovative and forward-thinking group where it works in the private sector, but is committed and has a strong mission to bringing the most effective and thought-provoking and measurable resilience practice into implementation into cities. So while globally we talk about making cities resilient very often from a policy level, and I will speak a little bit to this during the presentation. Many of you might know the Sendai framework for risk reduction. That's the UN's overarching policy framework on risk reduction, and it's a very, very helpful document for anyone working in this space. But as we all recognize, we have many years of research and academia and publications, and we know there's a problem. And the nice thing about working with a group like Pontarolo is that they're committed to really helping to comprehensively solve the problem. And that means in the built environment, in the physical environment, in the cities, that we start to bring practice into implementation and literally get some of these things on the ground, in the ground, and in the cities. And I'm just going to indicate to Suni real quick, I put together a few poll questions. And Suni, if you'd be so kind to release the 3 questions in the course of the presentation, we can start to get some data about that. But Steffi just brought it up, and she talked about how floods and hurricanes and typhoons and large-scale floods, but then also, very common, very regular, smaller-scale flooding, how these things disrupt cities and transportation. And we'll talk a lot about that. But for these poll questions, it'd be interesting to see what kind of experience you as participants have and what you've seen. And we'll see how much that links to the presentation at hand. Okay, I just saw there was a slight change in my screen, but I'm going to go back to full screen here. Or should Steffi, should I give a moment for the participants to answer the poll, or? I'll go into the presentation then. So, first things first. Whoops. There we go. Whenever we talk about, there's a quick poll. So 40% of participant cities flood. That's pretty high. I could have imagined it to be higher. Excellent. That gives us a little good indication. So let me get into the presentation now. What is urban resilience? Before I go into sharing some of this ground level data and this successful project that is going on in Toronto, in what's called the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, I think it's good for us to get a better idea of what do we mean when we talk about resilience? How does it relate to urbanization, to cities? And as we know, cities need public transportation. So in many ways, and it's a little bit unfortunate, a lot of international actors and municipal leaders and national governments and regional organizations, we haven't neglected urban transportation as part of the fabric of resilience, but it hasn't received the focus that it really needs, in part because urban transportation is built in and is a necessary component to any well-functioning, sustainable, and livable city. And if you do a little research and you look at publications on resilient transportation networks, there's a surprisingly small amount of data out there, which was one of the reasons why Steffi and I wanted to include me on this webinar, because this is a good opportunity to show you in what's happening on the ground in the GTA in Canada. So resilience is defined, and you can see here, resilience is defined specifically in its relationship to risk. When we talk about risk, we're talking about the sort of aggregate set of conditions, combination of probability of some sort of disruptive hazardous event, the consequences that result from it, and of course they can be natural or man-made. I would say, and increasingly more people are saying, that various climate events and climate disruptions they are natural in their genesis, but it is actually, the hazard is natural. It is the disaster that is increasingly man-made. So in a city that historically, was not that big and had a lot of green spaces, or didn't have as many residents, had, say, 40, 50 years ago, and a water infrastructure or municipal drainage that worked quite well, if it rained, they would not probably have many issues. But, move the clock 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years forward, greater urbanization, more people, more economic concentration, and that same rain hazard, that same hydrological hazard, actually will create some sort of disruption or even a disaster. And so we start to see that there is increasingly this relationship between natural disasters and how natural hazards and how they are turned into or converted into disasters because of man-made factors. That increases vulnerability, exposure, and capacity. When we talk about risk, we almost look at risk from a quasi-mathematical perspective. And there are three primary components in that calculation. It is hazard plus exposure plus vulnerability, and that gives us risk. How do we reduce risk? So and specifically, how do we reduce disaster risk? We do it by using this antidote of resilience. And you might hear me in the course of the presentation refer to cities as maybe having an illness or requiring a medication or some sort of therapy. Well, from that quasi-medical perspective, resilience is kind of like a therapy for cities. It can be a medication for cities. And what is it essentially? A lot of people talk about it. You might have seen a few definitions on it, but the one I like to use, and it's a mixture of one that is we use at the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and it's also similar to ones that are used by, say, groups like C40 and ICLEI and the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities. Essentially, a resilient city has the ability to resist, absorb, and recover from the effects of a hazard or a disruption, and to do it in a way in which it evolves. And when we talk about urban resilience, we're clearly talking about urban areas. We're talking about these units that are increasingly becoming more urban and more concentrated, more dense. And we realize that many cities still don't have the ability to resist a certain hazard. When the hazard overwhelms a city, they very often don't have the ability to absorb that stress. That's another word I will use fairly often, is this idea of stressing cities. What stresses cities and what stresses urban transportation? Thirdly, they don't always have the knowledge base, or knowledge and practice hasn't been transferred to cities to help them recover, and not only recover, but recover in a way that helps them evolve, and or what we would call within the framework of the Sendai framework, this idea of building back better and evolving. So we don't just return to pre-event exposure and pre-event vulnerability, that we move the bar a little bit higher, and so that cities are more protected, and their investments are better protected, their residents are better protected, and the next time something happens, we can mitigate, and that's another word you'll hear me use a lot, we can mitigate losses. We don't always have to suffer the same losses. We can start to reduce those losses. What drives risk? This is, you can see right here, the image. This is a pretty emblematic image. It was, especially for me, both personally, academically, and professionally, a turning point. This was Hurricane Sandy 6 years ago. And I'm sure you're following the news. It's Thursday morning on the East Coast here in the US, and about half of the East Coast, the southern half of the East Coast, I believe there are 5 states now that are under a mandatory state of emergency because a very large hurricane is bearing down on Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia, Hurricane Florence. And as Steffi said before, these are things that create a lot of disruption. So the image here is actually from 6 years ago, from Hurricane Sandy. This was like a 100-year storm, and we're seeing, because of the effects of climate change, that these storms are not happening every 100 years, they're happening maybe every 6 or 7 years. And this was a case of a city very close to where I live. This is Hoboken, New Jersey, and a very dense, small but very densely populated city, very beautiful town right next to Manhattan, right next to New York City. And essentially, the city flooded out, and a tremendous amount of loss took place. And the image here is of a taxi company that lost all its assets because there was just no flood mitigation. So what drives that risk? It's something that we typically call underlying risk drivers. Certainly poorly planned and managed urban development, environmental degradation and decline, poverty and inequality. On that point, we know that cities that aren't resilient, the victims tend to be the poor, the elderly, the sick, and children and women. That's almost across the board, and that will definitely be the case with this hurricane that's about to hit the US, or currently there's another typhoon that's hitting the Philippines. And the interesting thing here is that we are seeing the effects both in developed and developing countries. That's very much in line with the SDGs and with the Sendai framework, is that disasters are affecting more affluent Western industrial economies in very much the same ways as they are affecting developing states. Obviously, as Shritu talked about, the effects of climate change are here. Also, weak governance or lack of what I call resilient-based governance. The idea is that cities have really yet to turn to integrating ideas of resilience into the way they govern. Knowledge gaps is another thing that drives risk, is that we just don't know enough what the best practices are. That is starting to change a little bit with these global platforms like the UN Making Cities Resilient platform or the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities platform. But there are still massive knowledge gaps across the world, and we at Pontarolo Engineering, these are one of the things that we really are interested in, is engaging in knowledge sharing to reduce those gaps. Finally, exclusion of key sectors. And for the longest time, we looked at resilience as a policy thing or as a socioeconomic phenomenon, and that is all true. But there has been a tendency to exclude very key stakeholders, in many ways, stakeholders that drive risk rather than reduce risk. So real estate developers are a huge risk driver, and I think that slowly will start to turn as they realize that climate change is going to affect their business models. It's going to affect the way that they sell houses or rent houses, where they build, how much disruption they have in their construction processes. Equally, we haven't looked at, as Steffi said in the beginning, but as you'll see in this presentation, that for all the land and all the urban impervious space that we need for transportation in a city, it's ironic that we haven't really looked at them as a risk driver. Of course, we look at urban transportation as a net benefit, and it is, but we haven't begun to rethink that in terms of dynamically creating transit that can reduce risk and do things like stormwater capture and have more green infrastructure for CO2 sequestration and for tree canopy and tree cover. That's another type of risk that we're just starting to understand, and that is urban heat. One quick point on that: urban heat kills more people in the city of New York than violent crime. That is really one of the leading killers, if I can put it that way, of people. And anytime there's heat waves in Pakistan or India or Europe, or even more recently in Sweden, we see that that's becoming a risk. Why understand all this idea of risk and resilience? Well, by mid-century, 70% of humans will live in urban spaces, and that will necessitate that our cities, especially mid-sized cities, are going to need space for an additional 3 billion inhabitants by mid-century. Climate change and disaster loss. This is a big area, and this should give us a little bit of the parameters on what we talk about and why resilience is necessary for cities. Aon Benfield is an insurance research company, and they put out their annual report for 2017. We'll see how all these storms today in the Pacific and then Southwest Pacific, and now in the US, and certainly the wildfires in Sweden and all throughout the world. We'll see what 28 comes up with, 2018. But 2017 was the costliest year for weather disasters. There was over $353 billion in total economic loss globally, of which only 134 were insured losses. That is less than 1/3. So we're talking about well over $200 billion in uninsured loss. It's quite staggering. And the interesting thing about cities and the cities that I've worked in Latin America, North America, North Africa, parts of Central Asia, is more than 80% of cities have some sort of hydrological risk. Cities are at war with water. Simply put, cities have an issue. They're in conflict with water. Some of them haven't realized that they're in conflict with water. But when you look at the typhoons or hurricanes or coastal and riverine flooding, cities in some cases can be affected by all of these, and both during longer rain periods, like in parts of Central and Latin America, Mexico, but also South Asia, Africa. This is really one of the greatest challenges for the future, is how are cities going to behave with water? And that is something that we've been working on in Toronto. And I'll talk about the Greater Toronto Area in a moment. We are working to convert that and change that behavior and make cities more adapted to water. To give you an idea, when we talk about loss, there are ways of looking at disaster loss. There are obviously direct physical losses and economic losses that are quantifiable, that we can monetize these losses. And there are some losses that are a little more difficult to quantify or put a dollar value on. And then, if you look at the right side of this axis here, when we talk about urban transportation and trying to create more resilient transportation networks, clearly we're talking about this right side of the equation. So definitely property damage. I mean, bus lines being disrupted, stations being destroyed, actual buses or light rail stations or metros or bike sharing, a little less so on bike sharing, but all these larger capital investments for transportation suffer a tremendous amount of direct loss, meaning, like in that image before with the taxis or the opening of the presentation, the slide showed many buses during Hurricane Sandy in New York that were lost, that no one thought to move these very expensive assets to higher ground. No one thought to integrate better flood management into their depots and the stations. And so there was literally billions of dollars in direct property damage. And this is something at Pontarolo that we think that we're very convinced that we can start to reduce those losses. Then when we look at the quantifiable but somewhat indirect loss, then we're talking about business interruption. And if we're talking about transportation in cities that are particularly vulnerable, then that is again a staggering figure, that whether it's a city that has a short flood period or rainy seasons or longer exposures, clearly business is being interrupted. There are people who are not getting to work. There are businesses that are being closed. There are transactions not taking place. There are commercial interruptions. There are delivery interruptions. All these aspects of what we would call business continuity get affected. And I'll give you a quick example of that. There's a city that we're just starting to work with, very much in its infancy, and that's the city of Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. You would never think Saudi Arabia has flooding issues, but it has quite severe flooding issues. If there was last year a rainstorm, nothing major for most cities, but it rained very hard for, I believe, maybe 20 or 30 minutes. But the city virtually has no municipal drainage, doesn't have green infrastructure, and doesn't have any other technologies for stormwater management or floodwater capture. And that 30-minute rainstorm paralyzed the city for over 2 to 3 days. And it is the second largest city in that country. It is the major port city. It is the economic driver, or one of the economic drivers of the city, certainly in terms of goods and transportation, because it's a port city. And many of you will probably have seen this in your cities, that this happens quite often. So to move on to the next slide. Right, here we go. So urban resilience and urban mobility, and this is something that we look at, combining these two as a potential new opportunity of engaging with cities. Cities have neglected to understand the relationship between urban mobility and urban resilience. This is largely true. There was a 2015 World Bank report that confirmed this. That this is the area where cities really need to start to creatively and innovatively engage new technologies and to sort of integrate transportation systems as a way of increasing resilience. And this is something that we talk about at the business unit, the urban resilience business unit at Pontarolo, and that is creating more dynamic service, meaning it's nice that you have a BRT that works very well. But imagine if we're able to design a whole bus rapid transit system that is not just only for transportation, but has sustainability and resilience capacities built into it. So we get then more service, better protection of our investment when we start to combine these projects with newer technologies. So urban infrastructure, things like drainage, roads, transportation. This is the interesting point. this is where cities spend the most amount of their money. I mean, large parts of any city budget or national government's budget is committed to large-scale infrastructure, civil infrastructure, these types of big capital projects. But it's also the most expensive to adapt for climate change, and this is something that we need to keep into account. Moreover, when we look at urban mobility, especially bus rapid transit, when we have disruptions, then things get more expensive. That budget just to get a BRT to work is predicated on the idea that it'll never have disruption or very little disruption. Well, we know that the disruptions are happening more, they're happening more frequently, and they're more intense. So essentially, maintenance, repair, reconstruction, disruption, all the socioeconomic and community losses to cities, these things start to make those investments much more expensive, and we get less bang for the buck, as they say. So no matter how you look at it, urban resilience actually makes good financial sense when we look at it from the perspective of mobility. This is a World Bank figure. It fluctuates a little bit, but essentially for every $1 invested in resilience and risk reduction, that corresponds approximately to around $7 US in response, reconstruction, and recovery. So build a little bit of flood mitigation into your BRT line, and you will see that that small investment will likely be 4, 5, 6, 7 times. It will pay off 4, 5, 6, 7 times or more on that original investment. So the return on investment, the ROI, is very high. So when we look at making cities more resilient through resiliently designed transportation, I come back to that 2015 World Bank report, moving toward climate resilient transport. I suggest you read it because it's one of the only reports I think that the World Bank did on climate resilient transportation. And it's kind of a bit of the gold standard at the moment. We need to do a lot more research on this. But the line here from the report is countries are investing massively in transportation infrastructure, and such spending is likely to rise to meet aspirations from greater mobility and greater connectivity. And I would also add for greater urbanization. Cities are growing rapidly. Growing climate risks will impact the entire transport value chain. These risks raise the question of whether and by how much new or existing they raise the question of whether and how much new or existing transport infrastructure can be resilient. This question of the value chain of transportation, this is really where resilience is going to pay off, in that when we resiliently design these things with newer technologies, Pontarolo has some very unique ones that we're going to look at in just a brief moment. This is where we get into this, into the monetary side, and that value chains will be extended. The life cycle of transportation can be extended when we start to protect these very large investments from climate stress, and especially from hydrological stress. So now to give you some ideas directly, some visual material, and I'll walk you through some of these projects that Pontarolo has been doing over the last few years in Canada. This is really one of the most unique things, in that if you look at this image here, this is as you can see, a very modern, very beautiful light rail system. I'll be talking about BRT, but of course, we're talking generally about sustainable urban mobility, and we all know that we have to think in multimodal ways. So in this presentation, looking at this case, I believe this is from Waterloo. Yes, this is from Waterloo, a municipality within the Greater Toronto Area. And they made the very innovative and creative idea this is one of their main streets, which you can see, they blocked off a lot. There's virtually no car traffic. There's just a light rail that runs up this main thoroughfare. It's largely pedestrian. with this this light rail train service. Now, the interesting thing is if you look on the right side of the image, you would never know that that side of, about around a third of that street is yes, it's a beautiful pedestrian thoroughfare. Yes, you can see that there are all shops and restaurants there, and it looks like a very attractive place to have a walk or to engage in some, some shopping. You can see that it's an economic zone, but you would never know just on the face of it that that is a extremely innovative flood capture area. And this is what happens here. So this is so different sections here of the Waterloo light rail line. And before we got to that image right there, this is what it looked like before. This is some of the technology that Pontarolo, with their partner company, Wuppertal technology, what they integrated here in underground, so this is subterranean technology, is that under what we call the right-of-way spaces, the sidewalks, the tree spaces, under all of that is a tremendous capacity to capture stormwater and move it away from right here from the critical infrastructure. So here you can see that this is the light rail line, and just on the other side is on this walk space, on this right-of-way, you can, this is where the Wuppertal and Pontarolo installed what are called soil cells that have a tremendous amount of subterranean stormwater capture. They can not only capture stormwater, what we call pluvial water, so surface water. It's not only captured, it's not only moved away from critical infrastructure, it's captured, it's integrated into, and you can see here, a nice line of a tree canopy that water can be captured and maintained to irrigate trees and green spaces, and even below this for slow release into the aquifer using different types of sands and stones, and for infiltration, that water actually can be filtered and cleaned up a little bit before it goes either into municipal drainage or back into the aquifer. So here's a bit more of the progress of that project. You can see here on the left-hand side, these soil cells, what they do is they create this sort of boxed off area where a tremendous amount of soil is placed in. There are ways of making sure that pipes and other things are protected. This is this arch-based system that they put on top of these frames here, tops of these tubes, that creates what's called a void space below. The void space can be used for root growth. It can also be used to capture more stormwater. And on top of that, what happens is then we just pour concrete over the top, and effectively we create these extremely strong, how to put it, these very, very robust spaces upon which tremendous amounts of weight and load can be carried. I mean, if you've ever seen the aqueducts by the Roman aqueducts, the Romans were using arch-based technology, 2,000 years ago or more. This is very similar to that, in that instead of using a tremendous amount of concrete, you essentially use less concrete, but you get a tremendous amount of support. And so what it is it's not these little pieces that are creating the flood capture, it's the form of the concrete that creates that. To give you another idea of, and so just to finalize, that light rail system was in Waterloo, and Waterloo, Canada has flooding issues. They have flash floods, they have riverine floods, they have aging infrastructure, and that light rail investment is now made a little bit more protected because on segments of the line, they have this flood capture. So we can move that risk away from critical infrastructure and underground and filter the water and use it for irrigation and start to close off a little bit the hydro cycle. Now, talking about bus rapid transit, if anyone has the opportunity to go to Toronto, it's a fascinating city. It has multiple BRT lines, one of which is called the Viva line. Viva is the network. I believe there are 7 or 8 lines across the northern sections of Toronto, and in many ways these are feeder lines into an expanding metro system. Toronto generally is a great example of looking at multimodal connectivity, how you connect buses, BRTs, light rail, and metro systems, and it's really quite impressive, in part because the city is expanding very rapidly. It reminded me of a greener and of course colder Los Angeles or Mexico City, cities that are growing outward and quite rapidly. In Toronto, they have recognized that bus rapid transit systems, because they have a tremendous amount of space in the greater Toronto area, that this is one of the best ways to move a lot of people very quickly. And this is on this image right here is from one of the towns, I believe it is from Vaughan, just north of Toronto suburb. And here you can see very large bus rapid transit stations. Look, tremendous amounts of concrete, tremendous amount of right-of-way, and then the dedicated bus lines here. And what we're trying to do at Pontarolo is support cities in not only, of course, adapting to bus rapid transit, but look at all this space here that could be used in a more dynamic way. By using the Cupolex technology that is used under highways in Canada and airports, it's the ability for it to hold things as heavy as buses and planes and trucks is proven for over 15 years. Imagine if we were to look at this station area here and say, you know what, look at all that concrete. We can reduce the amount of concrete, and under these spaces here, under the right-of-way and under the streetscape, imagine if we can put kilometer-long flood capture. And the interesting thing is, therefore, we can extend. If you look, the line goes pretty far back up. I mean, some of these lines are 30, 40 kilometers long. Imagine if we were able to start to resiliently design bus rapid transit lines to have almost undisturbed amounts of floodwater capture, or making these stations, it's something that I call urban acupuncture, meaning, can we use these stations not only to move people, but can we put them in areas where we know they flood, and create flood mitigating sustainable metro stations and BRT stations. So how does this look? Here's one of the examples. So you can see here on the left-hand side, there's a large thoroughfare. Just beyond that is a BRT line. And in this whole right-of-way space, this is a sidewalk space, you can actually see the formwork, this arch-based system, and under all of this space, this municipality, working with Pontarolo, were able to essentially filter whatever pluvial water gathers and collects on the impervious space and move it into these void spaces. And I'll give you another image here. Again, this gives you an idea of what this project looked like. This is one case of where soil cells, again, were used, creating these verdant, almost like urban reforestation lines up and down the BRT system. Again, these are, you can see the void spaces for flood capture that are created here on top of the soil. And if you look back here, this is where like tree pits and the soil cells and green spaces will be implemented on top. For specifically the Viva BRT line, You can see here that essentially it's very quick work with some gravel and some concrete. Concrete is poured over here. It flows into all the corners, and when it cures, when it dries up, you create these very, very robust forms. And so what I'll do is I'll conclude this on this. I have some other information if anyone is interested to see more technical design from the technologies that we use. But to conclude, you know, if you look at this image, this is daily life in China. My wife is from Mexico, and when we go to Guadalajara in the rainy period in the summertime, this is almost a daily occurrence. These are these regular rain events. It rains for an hour or two, but because of so many problems in cities, the city's paralyzed, and people can't get to work. And if you look here, this is not the optimal way of moving people. And what we're doing at the Urban Resilience business unit at Pontarolo is just to start us to get to think on this on this idea. Imagine how people would move if 80 or 90% less water were there, or if there were transit lines that just didn't flood, or they flooded so infrequently and at such less amounts of disruption and stress. What would that mean for a city, and what would it mean that for municipal budgets, and what would it mean for you know, for reducing poverty, and what would it mean for increasing sustainability and CO2 capture if we had greener, more resilient metro stations, BRT stations, and actual bus lines in the physical environment. So I'll end on that, and I look forward to any questions from the attendees. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex, for the great presentation. I think this is very much a learning experience for all of us. We were just discussing among the colleagues here that we have, all of us in our respective institutions, done very little on linking transport to resilience. And I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from you and the projects that you have engaged in. I am wondering if you would like to do your poll now. I see there's 2 questions left.
Okay.
I was informed that if you do the poll, the presentation and the speaking cannot happen while, but we could get the poll questions up for people to respond and then talk about them afterwards. I think it would be interesting to see what challenges are the participants facing. So I see one question on. I'm not sure if you can still hear me, but we would like to ask, how often do you experience climate disruptions in your transportation system? And please select.
This is mine.
No, we can't. We can't vote.
Because we can vote from our option, can't we? We can't.
I mean, if I can add just one quick point, Steffi, to the poll question. It's more not a point, but it's a bit of sharing local experience here in New York. As I mentioned, Hurricane Sandy was devastating to New York and New Jersey, the Northeast. Over $100 billion were lost over not only the course of the storm, but years later. I mean, 6 years on, the New York Transit, the MTA, the New York Transit Authority, the Metro Transit Authority, rather, they had to close one of the most important tubes, like metro lines that connects Brooklyn to Manhattan. It's called the L line, and it goes from the west side of Manhattan to the very edge of Brooklyn. It is an extremely important access of moving people, especially from working class and poor neighborhoods to jobs in the city. And that line will be closed now for at least 16 to 18 months because of upgrades to necessary upgrades to the switching technology and lighting systems and electronics and all the rest of it. And that is all a consequence of Hurricane Sandy. So I see the results coming in. How often do you experience climate disruptions in your transportation system? 40% say normal, neutral amount of disruption, 60% say often. I'm not surprised to hear that. That is in line with all the global statistics. And it is really the mission of Pontarolo and the business unit is to get this data and to see how we can look at this and say, can we start to reduce those types of disruptions? And that actually should say, is part of your BRT line vulnerable to flood or stormwater events? Not floor, but that's fine.
Let's see how many cities we have with BRT systems. But maybe we expand it to public transport in general.
But even if your city, and Steffi and I have been talking about this, and I had the honor in April to work with Steffi and dozens of other participants in the Academy for Sustainable Urban Mobility. We called it the Awesome Group, and we were very much an awesome group. We did one very intense week of working together on sustainable mobility. And I had the opportunity to meet a really fantastic guy from Mexico, from a mid-sized city called Aguascalientes in central Mexico. And they don't have a BRT line yet, but they are putting it together. They've invested, I don't know, something like $45 million. In a city of 1 million, that's quite a lot of money, especially in Mexico. And in June, the many parts of the city that they intend to put the line through, the BRT line through, they realized that it experiences very regular, smaller subcatastrophic flooding. But then in June of this year, they had very huge flash flooding that destroyed, I don't know, well over 100 cars. I think a few people died in this. There were dozens of businesses that were affected or closed. And they realized that much or part of that BRT line would go through these flood vulnerable areas. So I was in Mexico at the time. I met up with Gustavo and we spoke with local officials, and we are in talks now to help them design a BRT line that is not only resilient to this type of stress, but creates this benefit for the city. If the BRT line is resilient, if the BRT line and its stations have a tremendous amount of stormwater capture, then that not only helps the transportation aspect, but has wider benefit for the city. If there are local businesses around these BRT lines, they're going to benefit from being less disrupted by floods. And imagine if you have a 20, 30, or 40 kilometer long BRT line and each one of your stations has some sustainability or resilient characteristics to it, then what you get is say a 30 kilometer long, not only a transit line, but then you get a resilient line and a sustainability line. And that's this sort of dynamic layering of services using the Pontarolo technologies that I presented. That can be done, and it's quite easily done. I was very happy to see that Shritu talked about at the very beginning of her presentation, just aspects of political will. I think that's one of the greatest risk drivers, is not having local leadership that realizes these things are problematic. But they can be resolved, and that's what we do.
Super, thank you very much, Alex. I see there's a question to Shritu, but I would like to ask one question to you before we switch again to the mitigation topic. Sure. You have mentioned that if $1 is invested in resilience, that stands in comparison to up to $7 in form of response and recovery that might need to be spent if the system wasn't resilient. So, I mean, you have made very clearly that there is a big financial incentive to invest in resilient infrastructure. However, the question that I would like to ask is, how do you get governments to invest in something that might have not occurred yet, or that might be a big initial cost at the point of investment? And I'm sure you have a lot of experience from the cities that you have worked in.
Yeah, that's always the big question of budgeting. You know, clearly it can be a little more difficult to tell a municipal official or a municipal engineer to say, look, in 5 years you're going to have something like, you know, 5 major disruptions and, you know, 12 medium level disruptions. So let me help you look into the future so you can save money. That can be a difficult thing to do when you're speaking about budgets and saving money. When we speak with municipalities and urban planners and their architects, you know, the interesting thing about this technology is it is actually upfront saving, and it is what we like front end and back end saving. It is upfront saving, meaning, you know, if you're creating void spaces where you can capture tremendous amounts of water, and you saw those little pieces there, like it's almost like playing with Legos. You can connect these things together and you create these void spaces. You can create the soil cells. I mean, to give you an idea how deep the void spaces go, we have tubes that are 2 meters high, and that can go on for as long as you want. I mean, creating these huge dry chambers under highways and bus lines and sidewalks and plazas and wherever. The idea is that on the upfront side, we're saying, look, you know, you're going to spend, let's say, $1 million, just to give you a figure, a general figure. Let's say for this mini project, you need $1 million of concrete for what you want to do. Like, you want to redesign a sidewalk. You will need $1 million for this project. Well, using less concrete means you will have less cost. So the void spaces that we can create save around, I think that the average figure is around 30% in cost. So instead of $1 million for creating a new sidewalk space, it's now only going to cost you $700,000. And aside from that, that's the front end saving. On the back end, then you not only are that $300,000 saving is going to be stretched out over the life cycle of that sidewalk, in that you're making it a more dynamic space. You're going to be able to reduce cost and disruption and certainly reconstruction costs on critical infrastructures. So there are front-end costs that we can talk about straight away, like just upfront using less materials will reduce your budget. So that's how this works on the front end. But then there are these longer-term savings that we like to talk about. And so whenever a city is budgeting for these sort of things, through our unique innovative technologies, we know that we can save money up front and create a maximum amount of resilience for the longer life cycle.
Okay, thanks, Alex. There's one question by Tevodros, who would like to know, how is the investment cost of soil cells as compared to the investment to larger storm water drainage systems? I think you partly answered some issues around the cost, but I think he would like to know more about how the investment cost is compared to an actual drainage system in the city, if there might be none or an inadequate one.
Yeah, that's exactly the issue that we're dealing with Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and you'd be surprised in certain ways that was some of the issues that are coming up here in Metro New York. We're working on some projects in Hoboken, and these are the things that we've resolved or reduced in Toronto. To answer Teodoros's question, there are pre-existing stormwater management systems out there. I mean, the most expensive and the most disruptive for any city clearly is to install huge pipes down the middle of streets. This is happening in front of my building here, like interestingly. And those very large projects are disruptive for local economies, for traffic patterns. They also have pretty high political consequences. Mayors and councilors get a lot of complaints the moment, and even protest. This was a case similarly in Toronto, where I forget the name of the municipality, but it was a more affluent municipality. The municipality said, we want to open up a long section of the street. The street will be closed off for 2 months. Well, the idea is we're trying to bring you benefits. So we're putting this big infrastructure system in just for stormwater capture. Well, the thing is how much disruption are you willing to face? And there are essentially two other, aside from the Cupolex technology with Pontarolo, there are two other ways of doing stormwater management in a subterranean way, and that is using prefabricated cisterns or big metal tanks, prefabricated tanks. They are extremely expensive. They are limited in the amount of volume that they can capture. You can't stretch them out for 10 kilometers or 6 kilometers. Cupolex, we can go as long as you really, as long as a BRT line is through this interconnecting quality and technology, that can be done with no failure, no disruption. Prefabricated tanks are good. They play a role, but they play a limited role for limited spaces and people with particularly big budgets. The other technology is using a tube-based system, and this is what, to share an interesting and innovative case from the city of Hoboken, New Jersey, where I've done some resilient work over the last several years post-Sandy. They're building what are called resilient flood parks, where underneath the park spaces, they've included something that looks like a radiator, and they're interlinked tubes. Again, quite expensive. They can be connected over longer distances, potentially, but they can't be connected into intricate sidewalk spaces or curves or corners and things like that, which is what we do. And therefore, certainly it has a role to play, but it is limited in terms of where this can go. And the interesting thing about Cupolex is, these are smaller pieces that interconnect, that are closed off, that create the void spaces, that create the form of concrete that can bear a tremendous amount of load. And they are implementable virtually across under any impervious space, a sidewalk, a street, a station, places that have piping and electrical cables below. We can control for that. We can protect those while still bringing the stormwater management underground, and at the same time above ground having the green infrastructure and using that water, filtering the water and for irrigation purposes. So of course, all these technologies are great. There are one or two other companies that do these prefabricated concrete blocks. The name is not coming to me now, but I know it's another technology. It's out there. Again, very, very good, but only under limited application and very expensive. Finally, it's implementation time. How quickly can you turn around one of these projects? And to put down a tube or a prefabricated cistern system takes a tremendous amount of excavation. You need a lot of engineering. You need several weeks to design the tank or design the tubes, then get them into the ground and make sure that everything fits. That takes months to do. And I've seen that the Hoboken Resilient Park took months to get the flood mitigation technology underground. And with Cupolex, because these are, this is the other interesting thing, is these Cupolex forms that you saw are completely, they're made of recyclable plastic. They are therefore sustainable. We're keeping plastic away from the water system. We're using it in the form work. And literally, it takes a few days to connect the systems, put some steel wiring on top. Of course, below you put a little bit of infiltration sand and like a geo pad below. And really, some of these systems are installed within a week. Like, we're working on a sidewalk system here that will have several thousand gallons of stormwater capture here in Jersey City, right next to Manhattan and Hoboken, also very flood vulnerable. And once we get final approval, I think it would probably take about 7 to 10 days maximum to implement the whole of the technology. And that is also where the savings come, is that this can be introduced very quickly, and it's as strong or stronger than anything else, using less concrete.
Thank you, Alex. And thanks also for linking the actual cost to the implementation time. I think that's important for many cities around the world. Now, there's one question that I would like to ask Shritu. It was posed by Gladys. She's appreciating Shritu's presentation on how cities can achieve low carbon emissions. But however, she would also like to know the challenges that are faced in form of the political process and the political commitment that Shritu had mentioned in her presentation. So Gladys is asking about any examples from Shritu's project experience where political challenges were faced and how those were overcome.
Thank you, Steffi. Political challenges phase is not done. It's not happening in 1 or 2 years. It takes time. But I think for the cities, there should be a political will. If I understood clearly the question.
If you have a project example where you faced political challenges in the implementation of the project, and how did you overcome it? Like maybe a government that was limitedly committed or had a knowledge gap, or can be anything.
For this, I think we have been working not only in one ministry or one certain city officials. We are working with different officials so that so the risk is minimized through that.
Thank you very much, Shritu. So there's one more question to Shritu. She has mentioned before that in one of the project examples, I think it was in Berlin, one car had replaced 8 to 10 cars as part of the car sharing system. But the question now would be, what does the city need to be able to introduce car sharing? And also, who are the actors, who are the responsibilities? And especially, how can it also become more of a solution for the developing country cities that we are working in, where car sharing is not implemented much as a concept yet?
Thanks again, Steffi. For the car sharing, I would say city needs a will and initiative. It could be initiated by the private organizations. For a beginning where there is no car sharing, it could start with a small community like university or colleagues going to work, or start in this small neighborhood where they can go together. But then slowly they can enlarge the scope and scale up. And there is always the apps that helps for car sharing. And I think for developing countries, not only cars sharing, but also motorbike sharing is also very helpful initiatives. I think they could start with the smaller scale and then scale up. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good point that is being raised here, that transformational experiments can also be the starting point of some bigger projects to come, especially because they help the citizens and the officials to shift the mindset towards a vision that might not have been known to them from before. So if there are no further questions, I think we start coming to an end. We have set a time frame of 1.5 hours since we started late. I think we are getting to our limit. Once more, for the people that are online, please download the presentations from our great speakers. You can find them in the handouts panel for download. Thank you very much for participating in this webinar. I hope it was interesting to you as much as it was for us. I would like to very much thank the speakers for their great inputs and their great experience that they have shared with us today. Please go to the links and download the presentations, because you will also find their contact details if you have any further questions to them. And before we finish off, I would like to announce that we have 2 more webinars upcoming. One is on the 18th of October on bus rapid transit system, and especially lessons learned from the Sastran project experience, which supported East African cities in developing BRT implementation corridors and start the discussions on BRT. So you're most welcome to join that, 18th of October. And the last one would be on November 6th. Here we are looking at how do you plan a cycling city and how do you build a cycling culture in your city. So you are most welcome to join these other seminars as well. With that, I would like to say goodbye to everyone. Have a good morning, have a good afternoon, a good evening, wherever you are in the world. And we look forward to have you participate in our next webinar as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everyone.
No, which one?
Oh, it's gone.
Guys, so
It's only for the technical